Hello everybody, let's talk about some fantasy series that I plan to read. So I've been reading a lot of fantasy recently. If you've been following the channel, you'll see most of my reviews have been for fantasy books, mainly adult fantasy, and I wanted to give you a slight overview of the series that I'm really interested in and that I want to read. Note that these aren't all the series I'm interested in. This is just a top 10 list basically for the fantasy series that I'm interested in right now. There are more, obviously there is a lot of fantasy out there, especially a lot of adult epic fantasy, which I've been really liking recently. So yeah, let's get into the top 10 fantasy series that I want to read. Number 10 is DISCWORLD by Terry Pratchett. Now this is something that actually got on my radar pretty recently. I was aware that this existed, but I was never really interested in it. Like people always say, like, yeah, it's absurdist fantasy. And I always thought like, okay, it's probably fun, but probably nothing special. But I've been hearing more and more people talk about this recently. I think that's just by chance. I've been on a lot of Discord servers where fans of this series have been praising it and have really been praising Terry Pratchett. I read a little bit about the premise of the story and I personally found it quite interesting. So the way I understand it is this world is basically built on a disc which is carried by 4 elephants, which are on the back of a turtle that's just floating through space. And I felt like, I mean, it sounds a bit weird, but it also sounds kind of interesting. It's not the typical kind of thing that I read right now, but I felt this was quite an interesting thing to read. There are quite a lot of books and you can read any of them, like all of them are basically standalones, like they have connections in between, but most of them can be read on their own. And they're quite short stories, and I think these can be good stories to read in between bigger epic fantasy books. Like in my recent videos for my TBR and wrap-ups, I spoke about how I burnt out a little bit through reading only epic fantasy for so long. I feel like this can be a good series that you can just read in between or even just binge if you feel like it, because the stories are short and it seems like a pretty fun concept. So what I ended up doing, I got the Kindle preview for the first book, which is The Color of Magic. I know a lot of people say don't start with that, but for me personally, when I go into a large series, I always give it some time, and I personally prefer to go in publication order. So I only got the Kindle sample. I'm not sure if I will actually start with Color of Magic, but I read the whole like prologue premise, and yeah, the world is essentially what I said with the turtle and the elephants. So yeah, it was quite interesting. I don't know a lot about the plot. I feel like the plot will be different for all the books and all the sub-series. There are different sub-series within this large series called Discworld, which is, I think, 41 books. I'm really interested in reading that. If you're a Discworld fan, let me know down below, like, where should I start and why would you recommend me to read this series? The next series I have on this list is Realm of the Elderlings by Robin Hobb. And this is actually also another interesting series that got on my radar pretty recently. So I've often seen that a lot of people who like A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin, which is my favorite series personally, they also like Robin Hobb's series and they really praise her character work, which I personally really like. I feel like I'm more of a character-driven reader. Like I can sit through boring passages in a book if I'm invested in the character. I was talking to one person who really loves The Song of Ice and Fire, and they were saying that the character work by Robin Hobb is unparalleled. So that really got on my radar, and then I started checking a bit. I am interested in this, but this never was really something that was high on my TBR, but it has gotten a bit higher because mainly this isn't just one long series. Like there are 16 books in this series, but you have like different sub-series within. So you have a trilogy in the beginning, and then I think you have a 4-book series and so on. You can just focus on one series at a time and then come back to it later. Yeah, Realm of the Elderlings is also another one that just got on my radar recently. Number 8 on my list is MALAZAN, Book of the Fallen by Steven Erikson. This is a fantasy series that is always praised for its world building, and it's always, people say you have to read, like, I think the first 3 books at least to even understand what is happening, because this series doesn't really hold your hand or help you figure out what is happening. It just throws you into the story and then lets you figure it out yourself. This is a series that a lot of people say, if you're an epic fantasy fan, you have to read this just for the world building itself. And I am very interested in this, but I'm also intimidated by this series. What I plan to do with this series is, I think Mike's Book Reviews has said he will read this in 2021. And I think I'll join him for that. Like, I am on his Discord server, and there are a lot of people who are planning to read it along with him. So I will do that. And yeah, I don't know a lot about the plot of this book. I just know that it is praised for a lot of different things. And I also know there are a lot of other series in this universe. This is something that I'm, again, interested in, but don't know a lot about. This will very likely be a big focus on the channel next year. Number 7 is the Gentleman Bastard sequence. This is another one that a lot of people rave about, but I have been hearing mixed stuff about this recently. I'm quite interested in this because, again, this is a book that is very praised for its character and relationship work, especially between the two main characters. And it seems like it is quite a different story from usual epic fantasy in that it is not really epic in scope, but it really focuses on a story in one city, as far as I know. And it also focuses on a few main characters. But I have heard that this is a lot of people's favorite series, and it has been praised by a lot of people. It is pretty popular, I feel like, on BookTube. I've been hearing a lot of good stuff about this. There has been some mixed stuff about this recently, but again, this is something that I plan to read, but I don't know when I will read this. Number one, because I think this is supposed to be a 7-book series and only 3 books are out. I heard that book 4 was supposed to come out this year. I'm not sure if it is actually still coming out this year. It may be a while until I pick this up, but I am interested in this for sure. Number 6 is the Kingkiller Chronicles by Patrick Rothfuss. And this is an epic fantasy series that has been praised a lot. If you've seen my How I Got Into Reading video, I link it in the info cards above, you'll know that I actually started reading because I watched a podcast of some YouTuber that doesn't have anything to do with reading in general, like he isn't a booktuber. I was listening to that podcast and they were talking essentially about their favorite books. And both the hosts on that podcast really liked the Kingkiller Chronicles, and this was really one of the first books that I checked, like whether I would want to read this. However, I did not end up reading Kingkiller Chronicles, despite the fact that it was something that I wanted to pick up pretty early on. The reason for that is that I've been hearing more mixed stuff about it recently, and also the fact that book 3 doesn't seem like it's coming out anytime soon. I know there was this tentative release date in August of this year, but it doesn't seem like that is an actual release date. And since I'm reading A Song of Ice and Fire and am almost caught up with that and will have to wait probably some time for the next two books, I don't want to add another series where I'll have to wait that long. So I don't know, Kingkiller Chronicles is actually still something that's pretty high on my TBR, and I may actually just end up picking it up. But right now it isn't the highest priority. Alright, so now before I go into my top 5, I want to name some honorable mentions, something that you might think, why isn't this on here? And the first thing that I want to mention is anything by Mark Lawrence. He has a lot of series. I think he mainly has trilogies, which are maybe, I think some of them are set in the same world, some of them are in different worlds. But yeah, Mark Lawrence has a few trilogies that interest me, but I don't think there is any one standout that I feel like I need to pick up right now. So I've heard his Book of the Ancestor series is really, really good, but I've also heard mixed stuff about his other series, so I'm not sure where I should start. I'm interested in the Prince of Thorns trilogy, but I've also heard really mixed stuff about that. So I'm a bit torn on Mark Lawrence. I do want to read him. I like what he does for the fantasy community. I feel like it's nice that he gives back to the fantasy genre, but I do not know where I should start with him. If you are a Mark Lawrence fan, let me know down below which of his series you like best and whether you recommend any specific order to read them. Another author I was really interested in is Brent Weeks. But now that his second series, the Lightbringer series, has ended and got a pretty controversial reaction to the ending, it dropped a little bit down on my TBR because I feel like, I don't know, Night Angel, his first series was already very divisive. I've heard some really good stuff about Night Angel, but also really bad stuff. And it's similar with Lightbringer, especially towards the end, where people say the series was really good in the beginning, but dropped in quality as it went on. So yeah, Brent Weeks is another one that I'm interested in, but it's just not the highest priority right now. And the third honorable mention I have is The Lord of the Rings. And the reason that's not on the actual list is because I don't consider it a series, I consider it one book. You could argue Middle-earth would be the series, and since I want to read The Hobbit, it technically should count. But yeah, Lord of the Rings is something I want to read. It's actually something I might end up reading quite soon. Obviously, Lord of the Rings is the classic fantasy book and fantasy series that everything that we currently have is inspired by in some way. I want to read Lord of the Rings. I might read it really soon actually, but yeah, it's not on the list for that reason. All right, let's go into my top 5. My number 5 pick is The Dresden Files by Jim Butcher, and this is something, again, this shot up on my radar pretty recently. I've heard about Dresden Files for a while, but it never was something that I was really interested in. People were always like, yeah, it's a cool series that you can read, but it's nothing special. But obviously the new Dresden Files book is coming out in July, and it was recently announced that another one is coming out in September. And since then I've been hearing a lot of fans, or a lot of people have been reading the series for that reason. And I've heard that the series just gets better and better, and that really made me interested in the series. So yeah, Dresden Files is something that I want to start actually quite soon. I think it might be a good fantasy read in between bigger epic fantasy books, which I'm looking for right now, because I did feel a slight burnout after reading a few epic fantasy books one after the other. So I want to check out some lighter fantasy books, and I feel like at least the early Dresden Files books will be good to do that. So yeah, Dresden Files is obviously, it's an urban fantasy series, it's different than all the other epic fantasy series I talked about here. And it seems like it's a more light-hearted series, and yeah, I think it just may be a really good counterbalance to the other series I'm reading. So yeah, Dresden Files is something that might happen quite soon. Number 4 is The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. So this is another very recent series. I think the first 2 books came out in the last 2 years. And this is another one that's highly acclaimed, but also kind of divisive. I've heard a lot of mixed opinions on the first book. I've heard a lot of great things about the second book. R.F. Kuang is obviously very praised for her work on the impact of war on the small folk, essentially, which I think is interesting. And this series is, as far as I know, based on Asian history. I'm not sure on which country's history it's based in particular, but I know it's based on real history. So this is something I want to check out, and this is something I want to check out quite soon, because the third and final book in the series is coming out in November again. November is very full this year. I want to read the first 2 books in the Poppy War. Yeah, I hope before the third book comes out. I want to see how this author writes. I'm interested in her work. I follow her on Twitter, which is also, she has a funny Twitter timeline. And she also updates sometimes about her books. I think she's writing a new series already. I like that these authors are putting out a lot of books. But yeah, this is something that's so high because it's ending soon, and I feel like it will be good to read this now. Number 3 is The First Law by Joe Abercrombie. This is something that has been recommended to me probably the most, apart from Brandon Sanderson. This is probably the series that has been the highest recommended to me, because people see, okay, somebody who likes A Song of Ice and Fire, they'll like First Law, not because it's a similar story, but because it is in a similar tone. Like, if you like dark fantasy, people will say First Law is basically read First Law immediately. And I have been interested in First Law. I think it is one of the earliest books I found after I started A Song of Ice and Fire. There is obviously the original First Law trilogy. Then you have a few standalones, I think 4 standalone books. And now Joe Abercrombie is putting out a new trilogy in this world, which is set after the original trilogy and the standalones. I want to read at least the first trilogy to see if I like it. I feel like I've been hyped up about this a bit too much. Yeah, so what I like to do usually is before going into any book, I like to temper my expectations, like not expect too much, just so I'm not disappointed just because I had too high expectations. And I feel like with First Law that will be hard to do, because I've heard even people who don't like dark fantasy stories really like First Law. I've heard that the character work in First Law is amazing. This sounds like something that I will really like, but I also don't want to be too hyped about this. First Law is something I'm not sure when I'll get to. I know I want to read this. I was thinking about reading the first 3 pretty soon, but I already have a few series I want to read this year or start very soon. So I'm not sure if I can actually start First Law this year. But the good thing is, if I don't start it this year, I'll do it next year. And I think next year is when the second trilogy will end. I think it might be a good plan to just read the First Law books leading up to the release of the third book in the second trilogy. So I might do that. I might read it earlier if I feel like it. First Law is definitely something I'm really interested in, and definitely something that I will read at some point. Number 2 is the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. So if you've been following me, you know I have been reading my way through the Cosmere. I've read 2 Cosmere books already. I reviewed Elantris and Mistborn. Both reviews will be linked in the info cards and down in the description. Brandon Sanderson is an author that I've liked both Elantris and Mistborn, and I've heard that the Stormlight Archive is his best work. So I'm already quite looking forward to getting there, and I know I will read the Stormlight Archive. Like, I can't imagine that I won't like his other books. I just like the way he writes. I like how he builds worlds, how he builds magic systems. Yeah, I think Stormlight Archive is something that I will definitely read, and I want to read this year. I think it will most likely be a project in the fall leading up to the release of Rhythm of War, which is the 4th book in the series, which comes out again in November, obviously. November this year is just crazy. Stormlight Archive, obviously, Brandon Sanderson. I think most fantasy fans know him. If you haven't read Brandon Sanderson, read his books. I would highly suggest Mistborn. I've read the first book, The Final Empire. It was really good. Yeah, so Stormlight Archive is something that should happen very soon. So look out for that. All right, now number 1, the fantasy series that I want to read the most is The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. This is a whole behemoth of a series. It's a 14-book series with 1 prequel book, so essentially it's a 15-book series. People say if you want epic fantasy that is actually epic, you have to read The Wheel of Time. With Wheel of Time, it's very interesting. I've heard of Wheel of Time actually pretty early. I think I heard of it when maybe even before I started A Song of Ice and Fire, but I read the basic premise and I wasn't impressed, I have to say. Like, I read the premise and I was like, okay, sounds interesting, sounds like a pretty typical fantasy story, not something I want to check out. I also thought, okay, a 14-book series, like, I'll never read a 14-book series. At that time I hadn't picked up any epic fantasy at all, so 14 books was like, that won't happen ever. I read a little bit about Wheel of Time and then I was just like, okay, this won't happen. I don't have to even think about it. But then I found out that a lot of people actually like it. I wasn't aware of the fact that this is such a popular series. So the more I got into BookTube, and obviously the more that these like fantasy YouTube channels like Daniel Green, Murphy Napier, Mike's Book Reviews got bigger, the more I got interested in Wheel of Time, because obviously Daniel Green, Wheel of Time is his favorite series of all time, and Murphy and Mike have been liking it as well. So yeah, Wheel of Time is something that over the last year or so, it has shot up on my TBR to this #1 spot, because I feel like now that I've read a bit more of epic fantasy, I want to go through the journey. I feel like now I know what kind of reader I am. I know I can go through bigger series. I know that I like character-driven stories, and I feel like Wheel of Time is something that it's basically maybe the pinnacle of fantasy, because a lot of people say that that is really what propelled the classic fantasy genre into the modern times. I'm interested in reading Wheel of Time for sure. I think it's amazing that Wheel of Time is something that has influenced so many different people. A lot of authors say that they have been influenced by Wheel of Time. Obviously, Brandon Sanderson is the biggest one. He's actually who finished Wheel of Time because Robert Jordan passed away, unfortunately, before finishing it. And from all I can tell is that people really like his ending. I feel like Wheel of Time will be something that I want to get into pretty soon. I don't know how soon. I do own the first 3 books in the Wheel of Time, and I feel like if I get time, I may start reading them this summer. Don't hold me to that. My goal with Wheel of Time is to read the first 3 or 4 books before the first season of the Amazon TV show comes out, which I think will be delayed now. Wheel of Time is something that I also want to cover on this channel. So yeah, look forward if you want to see Wheel of Time coverage as well. So there you have it, the top 10 fantasy series I want to read. Yeah, if you want to talk about any of these series with me, talk to me in the comments. Let me know which one of these you want to see. Let me know if there are other fantasy series that you would recommend to me. I'll see you in the comments. I hope you liked this video. If you did, leave a like, leave a subscribe. Check out my other videos. Some of them should have popped up on the screen right now. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.